like to hear from any one of you. Just confirm your presence. Okay, fine. Okay, so today's lecture is divided into three sections. In the first part, I'll be telling you the etiology, pathogenesis, genetics, etc. of hyperparathyroidism. Okay, and in the second section, Dr. Rosmi from medicine, she will be dealing with the clinical manifestations and the laboratory features of hyperparathyroidism. And in the third section, I'll be dealing with the pancreatic carcinoma. Okay, so let's start. So this picture I've already shown you in the last lecture as well. Uh, as you can see, this is thyroid, and on the posterior surface of the thyroid, there are two pairs of glands. There are four glands. The superior slides are not visible. Okay, I just checked. Is it visible now? Okay, fine. So this picture I had already shown you. This is thyroid gland. Wait a minute. This is thyroid gland. And on the posterior surface of thyroid gland, there are four glands, the superior parathyroid and the inferior parathyroid glands. Okay. So parathyroid glands are small, oval, endocrine glands. They are usually four in number, two pairs. So P2 superior and two inferior. But some individuals may have five or six. Okay. So one pair each is situated on the posterior surface of each lobe of thyroid gland. Embryologically, they are derived from you have studied this in anatomy, they are derived from the third and fourth branchial pouches. What is the function? The parathyroid gland secrete parathyroid hormone, and this hormone regulates the serum calcium and phosphate levels. Okay. In this picture, you can see that the glands are arranged in clusters, or like there are two types of cells. The one which are having slightly clear cytoplasm, and the others we are having granular pinkish eosinophilic cytoplasm. Okay. So these type of cells are the chief cells. These are polygonal in shape. They are small and they have round central nuclei. They have pale eosinophilic, or sometimes they have very clear, watery clear cytoplasm. Okay. And the oxyphil cells, they have eosinophilic granular cytoplasm. Now the chief cells, why are they very clear? uh, because of the presence of glycogen. Okay. And the glycogen may also be contained in the oxyphil cells, but the chief cells, they also secrete parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone is secreted only by the chief cells and not by the oxyphil cells, and glycogen is present in both the type of cells. Okay, fine. Now what is the function of parathyroid hormone? Basically, like in thyroid, there was a negative feedback, and there was a lot of control by the trophic factors like even the thyroid releasing hormone, which was and by the action of hypothalamus. But the action of parathyroid gland is totally controlled by the level of free ionized calcium in the bloodstream, rather than the trophic hormones secreted by hypothalamus and pituitary. So it is entirely controlled by the ionized calcium levels in the bloodstream. What does parathyroid hormone do? It increases, it acts on the kidney, and it increases the renal tubular reabsorption of calcium. Therefore, it conserves free calcium, and it increases the level of extracellular fluid calcium. Okay, it increases the level of calcium. Okay, it also acts on the intestine and it increases the absorption of calcium again. And it acts, sorry, not intestine, intestine also, it increases the absorption of calcium, and in the bones it causes increased bone resorption. So in either ways, all the ways, it is ultimately leading to increased calcium levels in the blood. Okay, and it also helps in the hydroxylation step of vitamin D. So basically, parathyroid hormone is increasing the calcium levels in the blood. That you have to remember. And it increases phosphate excretion, urinary phosphate excretion. Therefore, it is responsible for lowering the serum phosphate levels in the blood. So it is increasing calcium and decreasing phosphate. Basically, they maintain a constant value. If the calcium is increasing, the phosphate has to decrease. So, okay. Now, so basically, parathyroid hormone is causing hypercalcemia. And the most common cause of incidental, or you can say silent hypercalcemia, the most common cause is primary hyperparathyroidism because of increased parathyroid hormone secretion. But the most common cause of clinically apparent hypercalcemia is malignancy, the solid tumors. Now, why is it so? Before that, you should be able to understand what is the function of parathyroid hormone related protein. So they are basically rank receptors. These are known as receptor activator of nuclear factor kappa B. These receptors are present on the surface of osteoclast progenitor cells. And as this rank receptor is present on the osteoclast progenitor cells, the rank ligand, this is present on the osteoblasts. So when this rank ligand binds to rank receptor, it stimulates the progenitor cells and increases their differentiation into osteoclasts. And this you should know that osteoclasts cause increased bone resorption. Okay. So basically, rank ligand, when it combines with the rank receptor, it is causing ultimately bone resorption. And this parathyroid hormone related protein, it promotes this binding of rank ligand to the rank receptor, and therefore it enhances bone resorption. And many of the solid cancers, they are known to secrete parathyroid hormone related protein. So ultimately, most of the solid cancers, they will lead to bone resorption and ultimately lead to clinically apparent hypercalcemia. And there are one more mechanism by which these cancers cause hypercalcemia. You should be aware of osteoprotegrin. Osteoprotegrin is a decoy receptor of rank ligand. Okay, so one is the receptor that is rank receptor. There is another decoy receptor of rank ligand, and therefore it will siphon off the excess rank ligand, and it won't be able to bind to the original rank receptor, and therefore it will decrease bone resorption. So this parathyroid hormone related protein, it inhibits osteoprotegerin. Therefore, ultimately, it will decrease bone resorption. It will increase bone resorption. Okay, because it is inhibiting osteoprotegerin. Okay, so by both these ways, solid cancers can cause clinically hypercalcemia. Okay, now hyperparathyroidism is classified into primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is an autonomous overproduction of parathyroid hormone, which I'll tell you later on that what is adenoma and what is hyperplasia. So if there's an adenoma or hyperplasia of parathyroid gland, there will be an increased production of parathyroid hormone, and this is primary type of hyperparathyroidism. What is secondary? This is the compensatory hypersecretion of parathyroid hormone in response to prolonged hypocalcemia. Now what happens? Basically, parathyroid hormone production is controlled by the calcium levels. So if there is prolonged hypocalcemia, decreased calcium, so in order to increase the calcium levels in the blood, the parathyroid hormone, there will be a compensatory hypersecretion of this hormone. So this is secondary hyperparathyroidism, and mostly It occurs in chronic renal failure patients where there is prolonged hypocalcemia. And tertiary hyperparathyroidism is the persistent hypersecretion of parathyroid hormone even after the cause of prolonged hypocalcemia is corrected. Okay, so this is usually seen in transplant patients. Now, what is primary hyperparathyroidism? It is one of the most common endocrine disorders. It is an important cause of hypercalcemia. You know why. And the frequency wise, adenoma are the most common cause, 85 to 9 in 85 to 95% of cases. Primary hyperplasia, usually in 5 to 10% of cases. It can be water clear cell hyperplasia. You know, the chief cells, they can be clear, very watery clear, or they can be slightly pinkish. So when the predominantly clear, watery clear type of chief cells are hyperplasia of clear, watery clear chief cells is occurring, then we call it water clear cell hyperplasia. And finally, there is parathyroid carcinoma, which is very rare in very rare cause, 1% of cases. Usually it is occurring in adults, more commonly in females, 4:1 ratio. And most commonly mutations are cyclin D1 inversion and MEN1 sporadic type. And you also know about the MEN syndromes, the familial syndromes. So MEN1 syndrome, also known as Wermer syndrome, that is the gene involved is chromosome 11q, which is a tumor suppressor gene. In this also there is parathyroid adenoma and hyperplasia, so ultimately leading to hypercalcemia. And what are the other glands involved in MEN1 syndrome? You should be knowing that. Pituitary gland, pancreas, they are also involved. Adrenal gland also leading to pheochromocytoma. And then MEN2 mutation, this is also a cause of primary hyperparathyroidism. MEN2 also comprises of medullary carcinomas. I won't go in details, but you must have been taught this. Okay, and there's one more entity, familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. It is an autosomal dominant disorder. Here there is increased parathyroid function due to decreased sensitivity to extracellular calcium. I've told you that parathyroid hormone secretion is dependent on calcium. So, but if due to some reason there is decreased sensitivity to that extracellular calcium or bloodstream calcium, so the if there is decreased sensitivity, so uh, then and this is due to the defect in a gene that is the known as CASR, that is calcium sensing receptor gene, which is present on chromosome Q. So this entity is known as familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. Means the gland is not sensing even if the calcium is increasing, but it is not giving the negative feedback that a parathyroid should be secreted in less amounts. So basically there is no negative feedback loop. Okay, so let's summarize it in a table that the causes of hypercalcemia can be due to raised parathyroid hormone or due to decreased parathyroid hormone. Raised parathyroid hormone के क्या causes होंगे? The primary hyperparathyroidism, more commonly adenoma, then hyperplasia, secondary and tertiary, and this entity. And the decreased parathyroid hormone, maybe अगर hypercalcemia हो रहा है तो I have already told you the solid cancers, the malignancy due to parathyroid hormone related protein, and also if the malignancy is directly involving the bone, metastasizing to the bone and causing lysis of the bone, then again there will be bone resorption and ultimately hypercalcemia. Other reasons are vitamin D toxicity, immobilization of calcium due to any reason, some drugs, and granulomatous diseases. You don't have to go in much detail, but this table is in Robbins, so you should be aware of these reasons. Okay, this picture, this will be covered in the investigations by Dr. Rosmi. Okay, now come to parathyroid adenoma. So parathyroid adenoma, grossly, it will be tan to red orange in color. It will be encapsulated. They usually vary from 0.5 grams to more than 5 grams. Bone disease is usually more common in the larger size adenomas. They are, but carcinomas are usually of much more size. Parathyroid adenoma, now this is important that adenomas usually involve a single gland. Usually there are 4 glands, so adenoma will involve single gland, but this is not universal. And usually the extreme caution is suggested before even considering a diagnosis of multiple adenomas. So asymmetric, अगर एक gland से ज़्यादा involved हैं आपको लग रहा है, तो you should think of asymmetric hyperplasia more than the occurrence of multiple adenomas. Okay, so only usually single gland is involved. And parathyroid adenoma, they may be ectopic also, like they not behind the posterior surface of thyroid, but they can be in the mediastinum or the intrathyroidal region, thymus or soft tissue in around 10% of cases. Microscopically, mostly they are composed of uniform polygonal chief cells with small central nuclei. Sometimes nests of oxyphil cells are also present. Oxyphil adenomas are usually uncommon. Chief cell adenomas are more common. And rim of compressed non-neoplastic parathyroid tissue is generally separated by a fibrous capsule, and this capsule is often visible, and the normal parathyroid tissue is visible at the edge. Now, mitotic figures are rare in adenomas. You know, usually carcinoma will have worse features, and adenoma is benign, so it will have bland cytological features. Okay, so mitotic figures are rare, but it is not uncommon to find bizarre and pleomorphic nuclei even in adenomas. So it is so this creates diagnostic dilemmas in cases of adenoma versus carcinoma, because usually these worse, bizarre, and pleomorphic nuclei, they can be seen in adenomas. So you should think of capsular invasion, vascular invasion. These features are more significant in deciding between adenoma and carcinoma. And pleomorphism is not diagnostic of carcinoma. Okay. So what usually you can see in carcinoma: vascular invasion, perineural invasion, invasion of the adjacent structures, and metastasis. Now, parathyroid carcinomas are usually large. They will be usually larger than the adenomas, but they can be some overlap. They will be thick fibrous bands, but adenomas can also show certain cells trapped in the capsule. Mitosis is sometimes helpful, but not always. But obviously, proliferation markers, they will be higher in the carcinomas like Ki67 and all those markers which indicate the proliferation of cells. And usually in adenomas, you can say patterns like acinar or glandular pattern, but in the carcinomas, they will be usually monotonous solid growths or sheets of cells which are packed as closed nests. Okay. And in parathyroid hyperplasia, you will be seeing usually all 4 glands are involved, but again, sometimes asymmetry can be seen. And most commonly, you are seeing the chief cell hyperplasia. Sometimes auxentic cells, they can also show hyperplasia. Okay, clinical features will be dealt with Dr. Rosmi, but what I would like to stress is that primary hyperparathyroidism is associated with painful bones, renal stones, abdominal groans, and psychic moans. Okay, and one very important feature related to pathology is the brown tumor. Basically, there is increased bone resorption due to the action of parathyroid hormone. So bone loss predisposes the bones to microfractures and secondary hemorrhages. So this leads to recruitment of or influx of macrophages and an ingrowth of reparative fibrous tissue. So there is repeated influx and repeated fibrous tissue formation. So this creates a mass of reactive tissue, and this mass is usually brown in color because of the increased vascularity and hemorrhage and hemosiderin deposition and hemosiderin laden macrophages. So this is known as brown tumor, and it is characteristic of primary hyperparathyroidism. Okay, so now I would like to hand over to Dr. Rosmi for the clinical part of hyperparathyroidism.
Thank you, Dr. Shruti. Good afternoon to everybody. I will talk about the clinical features of hyperparathyroidism. So, Is my screen visible? Is the screen visible?
Now it's visible.
Now? Okay, thank you. So, after understanding about parathyroid, we have known that anytime when there is a overaction of the gland, that is hyperparathyroidism, the symptoms which we will get is because of the increase in the calcium levels. That is the one ion or the one electrolyte that is going to produce all these symptoms is the hypercalcemia or the increase in calcium levels. To label hypercalcemia, we should know what is the normal value of calcium. The normal value of calcium is 8.5 to 10.5 milligram per deciliter. Every lab will have a bit of a change in the reference range, but grossly it is 8.5 to 10.5 milligram per gram per deciliter. Okay. So now, before saying that the patient is having hypercalcemia, when you draw the sample of blood, we should remember tonicotine is not to be done because that itself will release calcium from the myofibrils. So that also is going to produce a hypercalcemia. So when such a thing is present, or when you draw the sample and you find hypercalcemia, so that then you start evaluating the patient. But what will be the symptoms, generalized symptoms with which the patient can come to you? Generally, some people will have, like as madam has already told about renal stones, abdominal groans. So here in CNS, if we see CNS, you will have irritability because there will be vague neuropsychiatric symptoms. The patient is not unwell, generalized tiredness, generalized weakness is present. Then there will be trouble concentrating. There can be depression, and there can be personality changes also. As the value of serum calcium level rises, then the psychiatric or the neurological manifestations also will worsen. So when you say that there is a severe hypercalcemia, that is when a serum calcium level is more than 14.5 milligram, then that is the time the patient will start developing confusion, delirium, and ultimately it might lead to a coma. Then apart from that, if you come to the kidney, what will be the patient's presentation? Stones. Renal stones are very common in patients with hypercalcemia. And these renal stones are more common in male. As such also, if not a hyperparathyroid patient, the chances of having stones is more, the gender which is more predisposed is male gender. So somebody who's already having hypercalciuria is also predisposed to having renal stones. Okay. And when these renal stones are formed of hypercalcemia, electrolyte abnormalities are known to produce tubular defects. They are reversible tubular defects initially. So that will affect in the concentrating capacity of the kidney. So you might also have a patient with complaints of polyuria and polydipsia. Then in GIT, there is a generalized weakness or anorexia. The patient will find it difficult to eat. They have gastritis-like symptoms. So कुछ भी खाता हूँ पेट जलता है, मतलब या कुछ खाली पेट गैस बनती रहती है, मुंह में पानी आ जाता है, खट्टी डकारें आती है. This is how they will tell you when they come to you to the OPD. Then they might also have constipation and pancreatitis. It can be an acute pancreatitis. It can also be a chronic pancreatitis. So either way, and pancreatitis generally presents as an abdominal pain. A patient will have an abdominal pain. They'll be bended forward. It is called the Momden prayer sign. This you will read when you go to surgery. Okay. In heart, there will be electrocardiographic abnormalities in the form of arrhythmias. There can be AV conduction block. The QT interval will be shortened. One of the very good signs when with such a patient you're suspecting hypercalcemia or the patient has come to you in the emergency, you have sent the lab sample and then epigastric burning. Epigastric pain can also be a manifestation of an angina, but in such a scenario, if you do ECG, hypercalcemia, you will find a shortened QT interval. That itself will alert you if the sample which I have sent might have hypercalcemia. Okay, then bones, as madam has already told, there will be bony pain. So there will be easy fracture. The bones will be so thin as osteoporosis has already occurred. So trivial fracture can produce, trivial injury can or trauma can produce a fracture. And if such a fracture is occurring in the vertebral column, the height of the patient will reduce. So that is why it is called as a loss of height. Kyphosis will be, there will be curvatures, bending of the spine. Okay, that will lead to, that also can affect the patient's height. And ribs, along the ribs and at the lateral margins of the clavicle, the patient will have pain. Okay, so that is also another feature. Then for hyperparathyroidism, almost all the symptoms are because of a hypercalcemia. The electrolyte which is producing these symptoms is calcium. And mild hypercalcemia is generally asymptomatic. So a lot of times when these patients come, they don't come for a symptom. Elderly women, they will, or men, they will come to the OPD with set of investigations कि हमने complete अपना प्रोफाइल कराया है, हमें और कोई बीमारी नहीं है, बस ये रिपोर्ट में ना ये ज्यादा दिखा रहा है, बिकॉज ऑलवेज द नॉर्मल रेंजेस आर प्रोवाइडेड इन द रिपोर्ट. तो पेशेंट रिपोर्ट में देखेगा कि डॉक्टर साहब मेरा कैल्शियम थोड़ा ज्यादा बढ़ा हुआ है, तो मैंने दूध पीना कम कर दिया है, मैंने कैल्शियम वाली चीजें खाना कम कर दिया. दैट इज व्हाट द पेशेंट विल टेल यू. ठीक है ना. सो दिस इज हाउ माइल्ड हाइपरकैल्सीमिया इज यूजुअली एसिम्प्टोमेटिक. एज आई ऑलरेडी मेंशन्ड, severe hypercalcemia, patient can have a confusion, there can be delirium, and there can be coma. And renal stones, as I've already told, male gender is more predisposed. Somebody who is having a hypercalciuria is also predisposed. And in CVS, apart from arrhythmia, hypertension and dyslipidemia, it can also be a contributing factor to metabolic syndrome. So these features will be seen in a patient with hypercalcemia. So this picture is osteitis fibrosa cystica. I put the orange arrow. If you compare the other phalanges and you compare this, there is a cystic change present. There is a cystic degeneration. There is cortical thinning. If you see the middle phalange and the distal phalange, you can see everywhere there is darkening. The bone cortices have become thinned out. So this is generalized osteoporosis is present. Cystic changes have seen in the bone. Next. So renal stones, if you see this X-ray, there you will find, you can actually see the shape of the kidney. This is nephrocalcinosis. That is, if the stone are deposited in the parenchyma of the kidney, it is called as nephrocalcinosis. But if it is present in the tubular system, it is called as a nephrolithiasis. Here, since it is deposited in the parenchyma, we can very well identify the kidney. So sometimes if you take the X-ray, you can find renal calcification also. This can be seen even in an ultrasound, but अगर आप X-ray करा रहे हो, तो you can find sometimes this kind of a scenario in hyperparathyroid. This Rugger-Jersey spine is a feature. Secondary hyperparathyroidism में पाया जाता है. ठीक है, what is Rugger-Jersey? I put the photo of a sweater or this thing. So there is alternate black and white bands. If you look at the spine is also looking like that. He alternate dark and white, So this is a Rugger-Jersey spine. Then here again brown tumors of osteitis fibrosa cystica at the ends of the humerus. You can see there is a cystic change. Similarly, in the hand again, there is a cystic change. The orange arrows are showing that. And if you go in for an upper GI endoscopy, esophageal ulcers are seen. There is a black arrow, that is an ulcer. There is a white arrow, that is an erosion. So this is what you will see in upper GI endoscopy. So after you have suspected that hypercalcemia is because of a parathyroid involvement, what all the investigations you will do, there is an immunoreactive parathormone level which you will be sending. Primary hyperparathyroidism, the level will be very high. Okay, primary and tertiary. But in cases of a secondary hyperparathyroidism, the level will be normal or slightly raised, not very high. So the normal values of a parathyroid hormone is 10 to 45 picograms. Okay, so here per ml. So this is how we will measure. IPTH has to be sent in a frozen or a cold sample. It is a labile hormone. So when you take the sample, it is sent in ice. You cover it with ice pack and send to the laboratory. Then along with that, you will do a serum calcium and the phosphate. Madam has already told you that parathormone will increase the serum calcium level and decrease the phosphate level. So this is what you will expect in a hyperparathyroid patient if you are suspecting a primary and a tertiary hyperparathyroidism. Secondary hyperparathyroidism, there is hypocalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. That will be taught to you when you come to the clinical side. Then apart from that, urinary calcium and creatinine has to be done and renal function tests have to be done. Renal function tests involve your blood urea and serum creatinine. If they are deranged, then you don't label the patient as primary. For labeling a patient to be having a primary hyperparathyroid, your kidney function tests have to be normal. And when you do urinary calcium and creatinine ratio, this helps you to differentiate hyperparathyroidism because of a familial hypocalcemic hypercalcemia. The urinary calcium creatinine ratio, if less than 0.01, will tell you that it is more in favor of a FHH, and there will be family history. And the hypercalcemia associated with FHH is generally mild to moderate. It is never severe, and there is a difference in the treatment of FHH and primary hyperparathyroidism. Apart from that, the other investigations which you can do is a BMD, that is a bone mineral density test done by a DEXA scan, dual emission X-ray absorptiometry. This will tell you whether the bone is predisposed to fracture. And ultimately, technician system may be scanned for identifying the or localizing the adenoma. Once you have diagnosed hypercalcemia and you have thought that biochemically this is because of a hyperparathyroidism, as madam has already told, adenoma is more common. So technician system scan will help to identify that. After identifying, what will you do for a hyperparathyroid patient? I told that all the symptoms are because of hypercalcemia. So treatment of hypercalcemia, medically you have to manage hypercalcemia. The foremost important thing which you are supposed to do for hypercalcemia is to maintain the hydration of the patient. The moment your calcium level increases more than 10.5 up to 11.5, oral fluid then you have to maintain the hydration, following which if you have serum calcium, IV fluid के बाद if oral fluid after oral fluid, if serum calcium is more than 11.5 up to 13.9 and it has not improved despite giving oral fluid, you are supposed to provide IV fluids, and only after that will you provide loop diuretics. Loop diuretics are nothing but furosemide, and we know that when we read about furosemide, there is a side effect called furosemide is going to cause loss of calcium in the urine. If that occurs, so your serum calcium levels will be improved. So that is why we use furosemide. Apart from that, there is something called calcitonin. Okay, that is a hormone. So that can be used. And zoledronic acid. They are bisphosphonates. So you'll be reading about them in pharmacology. And despite all these measures, if patient is not improving and serum calcium level persists to be more than 14.5, then hemodialysis has to be done. We will send the patient for dialysis. And in the meanwhile, while you are doing all these things, you send a sample and identify whether the patient is having vitamin D deficiency. If there is a deficiency, you supplement vitamin D. If not, then please don't supplement vitamin D. Then definitive management is surgery. So surgical removal of the gland has to be done. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shruti. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Now I'll continue with pancreas. In this section, we'll be dealing with pancreatic cancer. But to start with that, I would just like to classify the lesions which can all occur in the pancreas. And so basically, congenital abnormalities can be present like annular pancreas or heterotropic pancreas, or they could be a cyst formation, whether it be a pseudocyst or a true cyst. And then there are proper cystic neoplasms, malignant lesions, which I'll be telling you in this lecture, and childhood neoplasm, that is pancreatoblastoma. Okay. Just this to show you, this is a gross picture of acute pancreatitis. This is acute, and so there is extensive hemorrhage and necrosis. We have studied in the first 7 chapters also the fat necrosis that occurs in the pancreatitis. Okay, and then this is a picture of chronic pancreatitis where there will be more of fibrosis and cystic dilatation of ducts, and some of which will be occupied by the secretory material. And the cystic neoplasms, so they are categorized into serous cystadenomas, mucinous cystic neoplasm, papillary mucinous neoplasm, and solid pseudopapillary mucinous tumor. But you, in the end, when I'll share you the PPT at the end of the lecture, so in after this lecture is complete, then a few slides I've mentioned some brief details of these lesions. So you can later go through these slides by yourself. Okay. But today's topic is ductal adenocarcinoma of pancreas. So this is the 4th leading cause of cancer deaths in the US after the lung, colon, and breast. And what is very particular of this cancer is that it has the 5-year survival rate is dismal. It is almost less than 5% or maybe less than 1%. Okay. So that's why the significance of proper diagnosis of ductal adenocarpus carcinoma of pancreas and timely diagnosis. Okay, because these patients have very poor prognosis. And these ductal adenocarcinomas, they usually arise. Oh, I forgot to ask, is the slide visible? And is it visible to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. Okay. So these cancers, usually they arise from pancreatic intraepithelial neoplasias, okay, PAN-INS. And these are usually seen in the older adults beyond 60 years. What are the risk factors? It is firmly linked to cigarette smoking. Okay, you should remember that. No clear dietary factors are there, but usually they say that the diet rich in fats may lead to pancreatic cancer. Increased BMI associated with increased risk. Then chronic pancreatitis and diabetes mellitus may also predispose to pancreatic cancer, and occasional occupational exposures to amines is also associated with increased risk. Then chronic pancreatitis may be a risk factor, but it is not confirmed because it may actually be smoking or some selection bias instead of the pancreatitis. But some books quote that it is a risk factor for pancreatic carcinoma. And then obviously the hereditary causes, familial excess of pancreatic cancer, hereditary cancer syndromes, hereditary pancreatitis, BRCA mutations, they're all associated with increased risk. The most important mutations that you should remember, which are associated with pancreatic cancer are KRAS point mutation, located in more than 90% of cases, located on chromosome 12p. It is very important to remember. Then CDKN2A or P16, present on chromosome 9p, inactivation. SMAD4 is quite specific for pancreas, chromosome 18q, and P53. It is usually associated with almost all cancers. Okay. Basically, what happens is that, like in colorectal cancers, so it follows somewhat similar pathogenesis. In the pancreatic cancer also, there is a progression from non-neoplastic epithelium to adenoma and finally to invasive carcinoma. Okay, so basically in the initial stages, there is telomere shortening, mutation in the KRAS gene at the early stages, then inactivation of P16 tumor suppressor gene at the intermediate stages, and finally the inactivation of TP53 SMAD4 and BRCA2 tumor suppressor genes at the late stages. So this is a sequence. Okay, and this a very nice picture is given in your Robbins. You should go through that picture. Now, most commonly, it is in the head of pancreas in 60% of cases, body 15%, and tail 5% of cases. It is a highly invasive tumor, and it's important to remember that even very early pancreatic cancer is highly invasive, and maybe that accounts for the bad prognosis. And one more important thing in pancreatic carcinoma is the desmoplastic response, because this this neoplasia elicits a non-neoplastic host reaction in the non-neoplastic epithelium, non-neoplastic tissue, and it causes intense reaction comprising of fibroblasts, lymphocyte accumulation, and extracellular matrix accumulation, and this leads to desmoplastic response. Okay, this table is also given in Robbins. You should remember the KRAS gene in 90% of cases, P16, TP53, SMAD4, they are the most common ones. At least you should remember these genes. And there are certain syndromes which have show inherited predisposition to pancreatic cancer. Even this should be remembered. Like BRCA2. BRCA2 is also known to be associated with the breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And plus, now you know pancreatic cancer as well. Then multiple mole melanoma syndrome. There are some other syndromes which are known to be associated with the pancreatic cancer. Okay, now grossly, the tumor is highly invasive. The tumor will be, the growth will be poorly circumscribed, gray white, firm mass, and it can infiltrate outside the pancreas. Usually, it infiltrates outside the pancreas into other organs. Microscopically, I'll show the pictures in the next slide. Microscopically, it arises from the ductal epithelium. It is very moderately, usually moderately to poorly differentiated. They are abortive tubular structures, aggressive, deeply infiltrative growth, and perineural and angiolymphatic invasion is quite common. Okay. Now, this is a picture of a gross picture of typical invasive ductal carcinoma. This is the growth, and here you can see this is the lumen of the duodenum. Okay, the mucosal folds you can see here, and the tumor is almost protruding into the duodenal lumen. And this is the microscopic picture. This is one of the glands, and you can see that marked cytological atypia is seen. The nuclear, they are pleomorphic, they're hyperchromasia, there's nuclear membrane irregularity, and all those features which you find in carcinomas. Now, usually when the carcinoma is involving the head of the pancreas, so it will obstruct or impinge upon the bile duct, and therefore it will lead to obstructive jaundice. But when it is occurring in the body and tail, which is less common, it usually don't impinge and it doesn't cause jaundice. And by the time it is diagnosed, the cancer is widely disseminated. This cancer is also known to grow along the nerves, and often it invades the retroperitoneum. It can directly invade into the spleen, the adjacent organs, spleen, adrenals, vertebral column, transverse colon, and stomach. And this you should remember that it distantly, it may also metastasizes, easily it metastasizes to liver, lungs, bones, and even brain. Okay. And there are several theories also related to the cause of metastasis, why it easily metastasizes to the adjacent organs, or what is metastatic pancreatic cancer. Basically, which starts in the pancreas and it spreads to the other organs like liver, lungs, bones, and brain. And the various theories that are involved, like, are you aware of matrix metalloproteinases, MMPs, and TIMPs? Basically, these play a role in the pancreatic cancer dissemination. Okay, there are matrix metalloproteases like collagenases, gelatinases, etc. And also then there are some cell adhesion molecules. So some alteration at the level of cell adhesion molecules like VCAM or ICAM, intracellular adhesion molecules, occurs, and therefore they are ultimately they metastasize. Okay, so the variants, the histological variants, these are mentioned in your Robin, so you should be aware of these variants of ductal adenocarcinoma. That usually it is adenocarcinoma, the glandular type, but there may be some squamous component as well along with the glandular component, and it is known as adenosquamous carcinoma. Other variants are colloid variant, hepatoid variant, when it is showing the morphology of somewhat similar to liver, medullary, signet ring cells, undifferentiated carcinoma with osteoclast like giant cells, and microcystic carcinoma. Don't have to go in detail, but should be aware of these variants. Okay, and clinical features, they remain silent until they invade the adjacent structures, and so they will cause pain. But usually by the time the pain occurs, the carcinoma has spread into the adjacent structures, and therefore the survival rate is also very dismal. And usually abdominal pain can suggest neural plexus involvement, or it indicates unresectability of the tumor and poor prognosis of the tumor. Obstructive jaundice, obviously, when it will impinge on the bile duct. Anorexia is associated with all the malignancies, weight loss. Prurite is also again a feature of biliary obstruction. Steatorrhea when pancreatic duct is obstructed. And one more term is quite specific, the migratory thrombophlebitis, It is also known as Trousseau sign. Basically, what happens is it is quite characteristic of pancreatic carcinoma. They will, because there is elaboration of platelet aggregating factors and procoagulants due to the necrotic products, because there is a lot of fat necrosis and necrosis also. It is a very high grade tumor. So there is elaboration of procoagulants and therefore it predisposes to thrombophlebitis. And this is known as Trousseau sign. Okay. And these are some additional pictures of histology in pancreatic carcinoma. Like usually there is adenocarcinoma. There could be adenosquamous carcinoma. This is a picture of carcinosarcoma. This is a glandular part, and this is the sarcomatoid part, like spindle cells. You can appreciate here also. This is a spindle cell carcinoma because of the appearance of sarcoma, the spindle cells you can see here. Then oncocytic variant, where granular eosinophilic cytoplasm you can appreciate, abundant cytoplasm in each cell. This is the mucinous variant. Here there's a lot of mucin and only cells you can appreciate. Okay. And so this was ductal adenocarcinoma. Apart from that, there's acinar cell carcinoma also. Basically, this is the gross picture, and it has a necrotic center. And it usually in ductal adenocarcinomas, there's a lot of fibrous component. Like I told you, there's a desmoplastic reaction also of in the non-neoplastic tissue. But in acinar cell carcinoma of pancreas, there is usually no fibrous component. Like here also, stroma is much less, and you can see these tumor cells which are well differentiated and arranged in acinar pattern, and a very minute central lumen is also seen. Okay. And I also told you a variant of giant cell or osteoclastic variant of pancreatic adenocarcinoma. This is the gross picture of that, and like you can see, osteoclastic giant cells, multinucleated. So this is very specific. Okay. Okay, now the investigations, obviously ultrasound and CT will be done, but there are certain tumor markers which are very helpful in diagnosing the carcinoma. Like, and these are easy tests because they can be done in the serum of the patient. So what are quite specific of, not very specific, but they are associated with pancreatic carcinoma, CA19-9 and carcinoembryonic antigen. So you should remember this as well. And finally, the childhood neoplasms, that is the pancreatoblastoma. So it is the most common form of neoplasia in childhood, but it can also occur in adults. It is associated with Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome and with FAP or familial adenomatosis polyposis of the colon. There is bimodal age distribution usually in children, the average mean age being 2.4 years, and in adults 33 years. The mean tumor size is 10 centimeters. Now, microscopically, here you will be finding sheets, solid sheets and nests of tumor cells, but some acinar structures and some ductular formations can also be seen. And what is specific for this tumor are the squamoid corpuscles. Okay, they are a constant and characteristic finding. The tumor cells within these corpuscles often have clear nuclei, optically clear nuclei, okay, due to the accumulation of biotin. And stroma may be abundant and occasionally hypercellular. Like this picture, usually they are solid sheets, but some ductular arrangement structures can also be seen. And this is a big squamoid corpuscle, which is surrounded by small glands. This is squamoid or squamous-like. Okay. So that concludes today's lecture. And hopefully you will take your attendance. Who will take your attendance, by the way? You take your attendance yourself, or should I take the screenshots? Any comment?
Ma'am, organizer of the meeting can
Okay, so I'll take the
download
screenshot. Acha, okay, sure, fine. Okay then, thank you.